The court translator who heard too much. She spoke 12 languages fluently, but when the cartel boss whispered something in a dialect she wasn't supposed to understand, Maria Santos faced an impossible choice: stay silent or destroy the entire justice system she'd served faithfully for over a decade. The invisible voice. Maria Santos had perfected the art of being invisible. For 12 years, she sat in the translator's booth of the federal courthouse in San Antonio, Texas, converting words from one language to another with mechanical precision: Spanish to English, Arabic to English, Russian to English, Mandarin to English. She was the voice that others heard, but never the person they noticed. A T-47, Maria had the weathered hands of someone who had worked since childhood, and the careful eyes of someone who had learned that survival often meant silence. Her booth was a soundproof glass chamber suspended above the courtroom floor, equipped with headphones, microphones, and a direct line to the court reporter. She could see everything, hear everything, but to the lawyers and judges below, she might as well have been furniture. The setup was deliberate. Translators were meant to be neutral, invisible conduits of language. They weren't supposed to have opinions, reactions, or memories. They processed words and moved on to the next case, the next defendant, the next tragedy spoken in a foreign tongue. Maria's workspace was sparse but organized. A small Mexican flag pin sat next to her microphone, a gift from her daughter, Sophia, when she graduated high school, a thermos of café d'ala that she refilled every morning, a notebook where she kept track of technical legal terms in various languages. Though after 12 years, she rarely needed to reference it anymore. She had grown up in Laredo, the daughter of migrant workers who spoke Spanish at home and broken English everywhere else. Maria had been their translator since she was 8 years old, accompanying them to doctor's appointments, school meetings, and government offices. By the time she was 16, she was fluent in Spanish, English, and Portuguese. College scholarships came because of her linguistic abilities, and she added French, Arabic, Mandarin, Russian, German, Italian, Korean, and Tagalog to her repertoire. The federal court had hired her in 2011, just as drug war violence was escalating along the Texas-Mexico border. They needed someone who could handle the complex cases involving international cartels, human trafficking rings, and cross-border conspiracies. Maria was overqualified for the position, but she needed steady work and health insurance for her family. Her husband Carlos had been killed in a construction accident 3 years before she took the court job. She was raising Sophia alone, and the federal government offered stability that private translation work couldn't match. So she took the booth, put on the headphones, and became the invisible voice of justice. Most cases blurred together after a while: drug possession, immigration violations, financial crimes. The defendants changed, but the patterns remained the same. Desperate people caught in systems they didn't understand, speaking languages the court needed her to translate. She had translated final words, confessions, pleas for mercy, and declarations of innocence. After 12 years, very little surprised her anymore, until the morning she walked into the courthouse and saw her name on the docket for United States v. Alejandro Morelos. The cartel case. Alejandro Morelos was not a typical defendant. The file that crossed Maria's desk the evening before was thick, heavily redacted, and marked with security classifications she'd rarely seen in civilian court. Morelos was described as a high-ranking member of the Sinaloa cartel, captured after a 2-year international manhunt. The charges included drug trafficking, money laundering, racketeering, and conspiracy to commit murder across multiple countries. What made the case unusual was the defendant's linguistic profile. According to his file, Morelos spoke only Spanish and a regional dialect from Sinaloa called Northwestern Mexican. The dialect was specific enough that the court had requested Maria specifically, as she was one of the few certified translators in Texas familiar with its nuances. Maria arrived early that Tuesday morning, as she always did. The courthouse was quieter before a.m., and she used the time to review case files and test her equipment. As she settled into her booth, she noticed something different about the courtroom setup. Additional security personnel were stationed near the exits, and she counted at least 6 federal agents in suits scattered throughout the gallery. The prosecution team was led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh, a career prosecutor known for her work on high-profile organized crime cases. The defense was handled by Marcus Brennan, an expensive criminal attorney from Houston with a reputation for getting cartel members reduced sentences through procedural technicalities. Judge Patricia Coleman presided over the courtroom with the efficiency of someone who had seen every possible permutation of human criminal behavior. She was in her early 60s, appointed to the federal bench 8 years prior, and known for running a tight courtroom with little tolerance for delay, tactics, or grandstanding. When they brought Morelos into the courtroom, Maria felt a familiar professional detachment settle over her. He was smaller than she had expected, maybe 5 feet 8 inches, with graying hair, and the soft build of someone who no longer did physical work. He wore an orange jumpsuit and moved with the careful deliberation of someone accustomed to being watched. The proceedings began routinely. Judge Coleman read the charges in English, and Maria translated them into Spanish through Morelos's headphones. He nodded understanding at appropriate moments and responded to direct questions with brief, formal answers. His Spanish was educated, the accent clearly from Sinaloa but refined in a way that suggested extensive travel. For the first 2 hours, everything proceeded exactly as Maria expected. Morelos answered questions about his identity, his understanding of the charges, and his ability to assist in his defense. His responses were careful, coached, and entirely in standard Spanish. Then Assistant U.S. Attorney Walsh began presenting evidence. The evidence Walsh's presentation was methodical and devastating. She outlined a conspiracy that stretched from poppy fields in Sinaloa to distribution networks in Chicago, Atlanta, and New York. Financial records showed millions of dollars moving through shell companies across 6 countries. Intercepted communications revealed coordination between cartel cells and corruption of government officials at multiple levels. As each piece of evidence was presented, Maria translated the proceedings for Morelos. She watched his face through the glass of her booth, noting his reactions. He remained composed throughout most of the presentation, occasionally whispering with his attorney, but showing no obvious distress. The breakthrough moment came when Walsh introduced a series of recorded phone calls. The recordings were in Spanish, captured through wiretaps authorized by multiple federal judges over an 18-month period. As each recording played, Maria provided real-time translation for the court record. The conversations were damning. Morelos's voice was clearly audible discussing drug shipments, payment schedules, and territorial disputes with other cartel leaders. But what caught Maria's attention wasn't what Morelos said in the recordings, it was how he reacted to hearing them in the courtroom. As the third recording played, Morelos leaned forward slightly and whispered something to his attorney Brennan. Maria couldn't hear the actual words, but she could see Brennan's surprised expression and his immediate gesture for his client to remain quiet. During a brief recess, Maria stepped out of her booth to get coffee from the machine near the court reporter station. As she walked past the defense table, she heard Brennan speaking quietly to his client. What she heard made her stop walking entirely. Brennan was speaking fluent Mandarin Chinese, and Morelos was responding in the same language. The impossible conversation. Maria's language training had taught her to recognize even brief snippets of conversation in her certified languages. What she heard between Brennan and Morelos was unmistakably Mandarin, spoken at a native or near-native level by both men. The conversation lasted only 30 seconds before they noticed her proximity and switched to English, but 30 seconds was enough for Maria to understand what they had discussed. Brennan had said, "The Shanghai account needs to be moved before they trace the Hong Kong connections." Morelos had replied, "Tell them the Beijing shipment never existed. The manifest was falsified from the beginning." Maria continued to the coffee machine, her mind racing. Morelos was supposed to speak only Spanish and a regional Mexican dialect. His file contained no mention of Chinese language abilities, foreign travel to Asia, or any connections to international money laundering beyond standard cartel operations. Moreover, his attorney was discussing what sounded like financial crimes that weren't part of the current case. The indictment focused entirely on drug trafficking operations in North America. There was no mention of Shanghai accounts, Hong Kong connections, or Beijing shipments. When court resumed, Maria found herself listening differently. She continued performing her official duties, translating Spanish testimony and English questions with the same professional precision she had maintained for 12 years. But now she was also monitoring every interaction between Morelos and his attorney. Over the next hour, she heard 3 more brief exchanges in Mandarin. Each conversation revealed information that seemed far beyond the scope of the current case. The Vancouver operation was compromised from the beginning. Someone in the Justice Department has been feeding information to competitors. The judge's account in the Cayman Islands receives deposits on the 15th of every month. She's been protecting the wrong defendants. If the prosecutor discovers the Philadelphia connection, everything unravels. 3 senators and a cabinet member are involved. Each revelation hit Maria like a physical blow. She was hearing evidence of corruption that reached far beyond a single cartel case. Government officials, judges, prosecutors, and politicians were apparently involved in a conspiracy that dwarfed anything in Morelos's official indictment. But the most disturbing realization was that these conversations were happening precisely because everyone in the courtroom assumed she couldn't understand Mandarin. They were wrong. The language she wasn't supposed to know. Maria had learned Mandarin during her graduate studies in linguistics at the University of Texas. Her advisor had encouraged her to study Sino-Tibetan languages to expand her career opportunities in international business. She had spent a summer in Beijing, achieved conversational fluency, and passed certification exams that qualified her to work as a Mandarin translator in federal court. However, her official court employment file listed only 11 languages: Spanish, English, Portuguese, French, Arabic, Russian, German, Italian, Korean, Tagalog, and Norwegian. The 12th language, Mandarin, had been omitted due to a clerical error during her hiring process in 2011. When Maria had tried to correct the error, the court administrator had told her that adding languages to her certification would require a complete background investigation and recertification process that could take months. Since the court rarely needed Mandarin translation at the time, Maria had agreed to leave it off her official qualifications. 12 years later, that administrative oversight had created a situation where she possessed a language ability that no one in the courtroom knew about. As she listened to more Mandarin conversations between Morelos and Brennan, Maria realized that her unique position gave her access to information that could expose what appeared to be a massive conspiracy involving multiple levels of the American justice system. But she also realized that revealing this information would require her to admit that she had been eavesdropping on privileged attorney-client communications, even if inadvertently. The ethical implications were staggering. As a court translator, she was bound by strict confidentiality requirements. She was forbidden from discussing case details with anyone outside the courtroom, and attorney-client privilege was considered sacred even for translators who might overhear conversations. But the conversations she was hearing weren't about trial strategy or legal advice. They were about ongoing criminal activities, corruption of government officials, and what sounded like threats to the integrity of the judicial process itself. The weight of knowledge. That evening, Maria sat in her small apartment in San Antonio, staring at her daughter's graduation photo and trying to decide what to do with the information she had accidentally acquired. Sophia was now 23, working as a teacher in Austin and planning her wedding for the following year. Maria had spent the last 12 years building a stable, quiet life, focused on providing for her daughter and maintaining her professional reputation. She had deliberately chosen work that kept her out of controversy and away from the dangerous elements that her translation work sometimes exposed her to. Now she found herself in possession of information that could destroy careers, expose corruption, and potentially put her own life at risk. She researched the legal obligations of court translators who discovered evidence of ongoing crimes. The statutes were complex and contradictory. While attorney-client privilege was generally protected, there were exceptions for communications that revealed ongoing criminal activity or threats to public safety. More troubling was the realization that the corruption Morelos and Brennan had discussed potentially included the very officials who would be responsible for investigating her report. If Judge Coleman was receiving payments to protect certain defendants, then reporting the information to her was useless. If someone in the Justice Department was compromising federal cases, then going through normal prosecutor channels might be equally futile. Maria spent the night researching the backgrounds of everyone involved in the Morelos case. What she discovered deepened her concerns. Judge Coleman had been assigned to an unusual number of high-profile cartel cases in recent years, and several defendants had received unexpectedly lenient sentences despite overwhelming evidence. Prosecutor Walsh had a perfect conviction record in drug cases, but several of her victories had been overturned on appeal due to procedural errors that seemed suspicious in retrospect. Defense attorney Brennan's client list read like a who's who of international organized crime figures, and his success rate was far higher than statistical averages would suggest. By dawn, Maria had made her decision. The recording. Next morning, Maria arrived at the courthouse with a small digital recording device hidden in her purse. She had purchased it the night before, along with software that would allow her to isolate and enhance audio recordings. Her plan was simple: record the Mandarin conversations between Morelos and Brennan, transcribe them accurately, and then find a way to report the information to law enforcement officials who were not potentially compromised. The recording device was voice-activated and small enough to hide inside her translator's booth. She positioned it near her microphone setup, where it would capture any conversations happening near the defense table during recesses or sidebar conferences. As court resumed for the second day of proceedings, Maria felt the weight of her decision settling over her. She was crossing a line from passive observer to active participant in whatever conspiracy she was uncovering. The morning proceeded without significant Mandarin conversations. Morelos and Brennan communicated primarily in Spanish and English, discussing routine legal matters related to the current case. But during the lunch recess, as most of the courtroom cleared out, Maria heard Brennan speaking urgently to his client. In Mandarin, the Seattle contact says the FBI has discovered the Vancouver connection. They know about the Chinese investors and the parliamentary influence in Ottawa. We need to accelerate the timeline and move the Toronto assets before they freeze everything. Morelos replied. What about the judge? Will she still rule favorably on the motion to dismiss if the pressure increases? Coleman is solid, but only as long as the deposits continue and no one traces them back to the Hong Kong shell companies. If this investigation expands beyond drug trafficking to international money laundering, she won't be able to protect us without exposing herself. And the prosecutor? Walsh doesn't know anything about the political connections. She thinks this is a simple cartel case, but if someone tips her off about the broader conspiracy, she's honest enough to pursue it aggressively. The conversation continued for another 2 minutes, revealing details about political corruption in Canada, money laundering operations spanning 3 countries, and ongoing bribery of federal officials in the United States. Maria's recording device captured every word. The investigation that evening, Maria transcribed the Mandarin conversations she had recorded. The picture that emerged was far more complex than a simple drug trafficking case. Morelos appeared to be connected to an international network that combined traditional cartel operations with sophisticated financial crimes and political corruption. The conspiracy involved Chinese investors using cartel money laundering networks to move funds through North American banks' payoffs to federal judges, prosecutors, and politicians in both the United States and Canada. Systematic corruption of cases involving international, organized crime cover-ups of connections between drug cartels and foreign government officials. The scope of the corruption was breathtaking. According to the conversations Maria had recorded, at least 12 federal cases had been compromised over the previous 3 years, with defendants receiving favorable treatment in exchange for maintaining silence about the broader conspiracy. Maria realized that she was in possession of evidence that could trigger investigations reaching the highest levels of government in multiple countries. But she also realized that reporting the information through normal channels could be dangerous for her personally. If the conspiracy included federal judges and prosecutors, then any report she made could be compromised before it reached honest law enforcement officials. Worse, the conspirators would know that someone had discovered their secret, and they would likely deduce that the leak came from the translator who had access to their conversations. After researching her options, Maria decided to contact the FBI's Public Corruption Unit directly, bypassing local federal prosecutors who might be compromised. She also reached out to an investigative journalist named David Chen, who worked for the Washington Post and specialized in exposing government corruption. Her approach was careful and methodical. She provided both contacts with transcripts of the Mandarin conversations, audio recordings of the original exchanges, and detailed background research on all the individuals involved in the case. But she also took precautions to protect herself. She made copies of all evidence and stored them in multiple secure locations. She informed her daughter Sophia about the situation and arranged for her to stay with relatives in Austin until the investigation was resolved. She also consulted with the criminal defense attorney about her own potential legal liability for recording privileged conversations. The revelation there weeks after Maria first contacted the FBI. Agents arrested Judge Patricia Coleman at her home in San Antonio. The arrest warrant cited evidence of accepting bribes, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to commit racketeering. The same day, search warrants were executed on the offices of Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh, Defense Attorney Marcus Brennan, and 12 other individuals connected to the money laundering conspiracy. Alejandro Morelos, who was already in federal custody, was served with additional charges related to international money laundering, political corruption, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. The arrests were the result of a 3-week investigation that federal officials described as one of the most significant corruption cases in Texas history. The investigation had uncovered evidence of systematic corruption involving federal judges, prosecutors, and politicians in 3 countries. What the public didn't know was that the entire investigation had been triggered by a court translator who had overheard conversations in a language she wasn't supposed to understand. The aftermath. Maria's role in exposing the conspiracy remained classified for several months while the FBI completed its investigation. During that time, she continued working as a court translator, though she was quietly reassigned to cases that didn't involve any of the individuals under investigation. The scope of the corruption revealed through her recordings was staggering. The investigation ultimately led to indictments of 3 federal judge charges against 7 prosecutors and 12 defense attorneys, the resignation of 2 U.S. senators and 1 cabinet member, international arrest warrants for Chinese nationals involved in money laundering, diplomatic tensions between the United States and Canada over political corruption. When Maria's identity as the whistleblower was finally revealed, she faced a complex mix of praise and criticism. Civil rights organizations hailed her as a hero who had exposed systematic corruption. Legal ethics experts debated whether her recording of privileged conversations was justified by the evidence of ongoing crimes. Defense attorneys involved in the conspiracy sued the federal government, arguing that Maria's actions had violated attorney-client privilege and that all evidence derived from her recordings should be suppressed. The legal challenges continued for months, though most ultimately failed when courts ruled that attorney-client privilege doesn't protect communications about ongoing criminal activity. The personal cost revelation of Maria's role in the investigation changed her life permanently. She received death threats from associates of the organized crime figures whose operations had been exposed. Federal authorities provided her with protection and relocated her to a different city. The stress of the investigation and its aftermath took a toll on her health and her relationship with her daughter. Sophia was proud of her mother's courage, but worried about the ongoing safety risks. The quiet, stable life that Maria had built over 12 years was gone, replaced by the uncertainty that comes with being a high-profile whistleblower in a case involving international organized crime. Maria also faced financial challenges. While she eventually received a substantial reward under the federal whistleblower protection program, she was unable to continue working as a court translator due to safety concerns and the controversy surrounding her role in the case. But she also received something she hadn't expected: recognition that her actions had helped preserve the integrity of the justice system she had served faithfully for over a decade. The trial. 18 months after the initial arrests, the federal government proceeded to trial against Judge Coleman, prosecutor Walsh, and 12 other defendants. The trial became a media sensation, with coverage focusing on the scope of the corruption and the unusual circumstances that had led to its discovery. Maria testified for 3 days about the conversations she had overheard and recorded. Defense attorneys attempted to discredit her testimony by arguing that she had violated professional ethics and attorney-client privilege. But prosecutors successfully argued that her actions were justified by the evidence of ongoing criminal activity and threats to the integrity of the judicial system. The recordings she had made were played in open court, with Maria providing official translations from Mandarin to English. The conversations were devastating to the defense, providing clear evidence of bribery, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. Judge Coleman was convicted on all charges and sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. Walsh was found guilty of lesser charges and sentenced to 5 years. Brennan received 12 years for his role in the conspiracy. Alejandro Morelos, who had initially faced only drug trafficking charges, was ultimately convicted of racketeering, money laundering, and conspiracy charges that carried a life sentence without parole. The Legaside case became known as the translator tapes scandal and led to significant reforms in federal court procedures. New rules were implemented requiring disclosure of all language abilities by court translators, and additional safeguards were put in place to prevent the type of corruption that Maria had uncovered. The case also sparked national discussions about the balance between attorney-client privilege and the public's right to know about government corruption. Legal scholars debated whether Maria's actions represented a necessary exception to professional confidentiality rules or a dangerous precedent that could undermine the attorney-client relationship. For Maria, the legacy was more personal. She had proven that even someone in the most invisible position in the courtroom could play a crucial role in preserving justice. Her willingness to risk her career and her safety had exposed a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of government and prevented the continued corruption of federal prosecutions. 5 years after the trial, Maria published a memoir titled, "The Invisible Voice: How I Heard the Truth They Didn't Want Me to Understand." The book became a bestseller and was adapted into a documentary film that won several awards for its examination of government corruption and whistleblower protection. Reflection today. Maria Santos works as a consultant for federal law enforcement agencies, helping to train investigators about the linguistic and cultural complexities of international organized crime cases. She speaks regularly at law schools and government conferences about the ethical obligations of court personnel who discover evidence of corruption. She remains proud of her decision to speak up, despite the personal costs. In interviews, she often says that her 12 years of invisible service in the translator's booth prepared her for the moment when silence would have been complicity. "I spent my entire career being the voice that others heard but never the person they noticed," she reflects. But sometimes the most important conversations are the ones that happen when people think no one is listening. And sometimes the most invisible person in the room is the only one who can see what's really happening. The case serves as a reminder that justice often depends on the courage of individuals who choose to speak truth to power, even when that choice comes with significant personal risk. Maria Santos's story demonstrates that integrity and professional excellence can create opportunities to serve a cause greater than any single career or case. In the end, her mastery of a language she wasn't supposed to know became the key to exposing corruption that threatened the very foundation of the justice system she had devoted her life to serving. Sometimes the most powerful truths are whispered in languages that those in power assume no one else understands. her story continues to inspire court personnel, translators, and government employees who face similar ethical dilemmas. It stands as proof that one person with courage and linguistic skills can make a difference when the stakes are highest and the truth matters most.